episode 2 of Let's Talk History. Today we're going to focus on Adolf Hitler, one of the most despicable and evil men in the 20th century, perhaps even in history. Going to focus mainly on the man, the person, his early development in his life before he became Chancellor and Führer of Germany, and then in lead up to World War II. What we'll focus less on is the Holocaust. That will be a video of its own, to give it the justice it deserves. Probably take up the whole amount of time of a full video. So, who was he? Basically, he was born in 1889 in southern Austria, on the German-Austrian frontier, to a civil servant father, and whose footsteps he decided very, very early on in his life he was not going to follow. So he began flunking in school, if you will, and eventually dropped out. He decided after his father died in 1903 that he was going to be an artist. He was rejected from the Vienna School of Art several times, and his life appeared to have no purpose. Upon his mother dying in 1908, he moved to Vienna following the receipt of a family inheritance. He carved out a very menial living there, selling his portraits that were deemed not good enough for the School of Art, but were good enough for tourists. While there, he did develop much of his political ideals. He read very, very heavily. He looked around Vienna and saw a city seeped in corruption, seeped in the control of, well, he saw it in control of the Jews. He saw a large Jewish contingent in Vienna. The truth of that is that it was not that high, however, to someone who never lived in the city to move into the city, and he's seen what he wanted to see, if you will. One of his friends, or someone who lodged with him, August Kubizek, said that he was unimpressed, and everywhere that Hitler looked he saw hate and injustice, and this just festered for him. But he was very much a nobody, and he looked to be going absolutely nowhere. However, in 1913 he moved from Vienna to Munich in Bavaria to avoid military service for the Austrian army. When World War I broke out, or the First World War broke out, Hitler signed up to be part of the Reserve Infantry Regiment in Bavaria, and he was allowed to join. Now, one of the most famous pictures that did the rounds is, I'll post up, is of Hitler being in the crowd when war was announced. Now, that picture is very much considered to be a forgery, due to the fact that in 1914 Hitler did not have his infamous toothbrush moustache that he is famous for, and that picture only started doing the rounds when he was sort of had his patriotism questioned as he was taking over the leadership of Germany. Now, Hitler was part of the First World War. He was part of the German army. He was stationed to some of the biggest battles of the First World War, including the Battle of the Somme, and he was injured in the leg in 1916 during that battle, and was temporarily blinded in 1918 near Ypres. While he was recuperating from that, Germany surrendered and the First World War was brought to an end. Now, this was an event or decision which Hitler would very much latch onto and use as part of his political growth and part of his main gripe with the German people, German sort of political class. Obviously the Kaiser abdicated and the Weimar Republic was created. This was put in place after a brief flirtation with with communism and a Soviet Republic of Bavaria. It was put down by the army, or the returning army officers. Now, in the early 1920s, Hitler was tasked with going around to visit different political parties and get a feel for what they were saying and what their ideas were. And one of these was the German Workers' Party. Now, Hitler decided to start giving speeches at these meetings, and he went from being an army informer to a party member. He was given he was party member number 55. However, his number was greatly exaggerated to make the party seem bigger. I believe it was 155 he was given. Now, he was allowed, this wasn't something he did against the army, he was done with the permission of the army as well. So as much as he had moved from being an informer to being a party member and started to grow into the party and started to believe what the party was saying, he did this with the permission of the army. Now, he became a very fiery speaker, and people that knew him said there was a total contrast between the man in public and the man in private. He was very soft spoken, very meek when he wasn't doing speeches, but as soon as he went forward and had to give those speeches and had to put forward his political ideas, he seemed to turn into a whole other person. Now, in 1920, that was when the German Workers' Party was changed to the now name National Socialist German Workers' Party, which became known as the Nazis for short, and the name which will go down in history, linked to one of the greatest crimes of the 20th century. 1921, Hitler becomes the chairman of the party and took total control. What Hitler used to do quite a lot of times whenever he wanted something was either threaten to resign or threaten to kill himself. And he always pushed that, and this is something that we'll come on to in a few minutes as well. He did that throughout his entire career. He did it with other politicians, did it with other leaders, he did it with Britain, he did it with France, just to see how far he could push things, how extreme did he need to go in order to get what he wanted, and how far could he push people. Now, Nazis continued to do speeches, Hitler continued to do speeches, marches, the stormtroopers became a common sight in the streets, and this was until 1923, on the 8/9th of November, they attempted to emulate Mussolini's march on Rome with what became known as the Beer Hall Putsch. This is where they took the head of the Bavarian police, the state commissioner of Bavaria, and the head of the army in Bavaria prisoner, and made them support the overthrow of the current government in order to replace them with Hitler and the Nazis. However, while Hitler was away securing support for the revolution elsewhere, one of the other co-conspirators let all three men leave in order to, on the basis that they would go and drum up the support as well. As soon as they were let go, they disavowed the whole thing, and the army was brought in to put down the Beer Hall Putsch. Now, during this time, Hitler was actually shot in the arm, as was Hermann Göring, future leader, head of the Luftwaffe. He was shot in the groin. There was 16 members of the Nazi Party were killed during that, which they would then use as a martyrdom. There were 16 martyrs, and the blood flag, which would be sort of rubbed into all the army, and they would take a touch of the blood flag from that night. Hitler was arrested and put on trial in the People's Court of Bavaria, and it was essentially a free rein for him to articulate his ideas, particularly his nationalistic and anti-Marxist, anti-democratic, anti-Semitic ideas to the court, and he was given 5 years in Landsberg prison instead of 9 months of that sentence. Now, in that 9 months, he would come to compile the text, which is again well known and oft-cited when it comes to Adolf Hitler, and again infamous. That book is Mein Kampf. It is 600 pages of rambling. It's 600 pages of very little sense. 600 pages of Hitler creating the world according to Adolf Hitler, and his past according to him as well. There's a lot of stretching of the truth, and there's a lot of misrepresentation of his family life, his upbringing, his political birth, his political education. And there's a few quotes that come out in there, and one in particular which I'll post up. It's very prophetic. It's very, very foretelling or foreboding or foreshadowing, and it refers to the war. However, it's the wording of it, and that's where it says, at the beginning of the war, or even during the war, if 12 or 15,000 of these Jews who were corrupting the nation had been forced to submit to poison gas, just as hundreds of thousands of our best German workers from every social stratum and from every trade and calling had to face it in the field, then the millions of sacrifices made at the front would not have been in vain. On the contrary, if 12,000 of these malefactors had been eliminated in proper time, probably the lives of a million decent men who would have been of value to Germany in the future might have been saved. So we get an idea that he very much blamed a certain group of people, in this case the Jews, for the defeat of Germany in the First World War, and we get an idea of what he thinks should have been done for them, and something that he would later be privy to in the murder of 6 million of them, alongside millions of other undesirables, as the Nazis would call them, and aliens, as the Nazis would call them. So he spent his 9 months in prison. He very much sort of came out. He was barred from speaking for a few years, until the political class again deemed him no longer a threat, which was a huge mistake. Germany, by the late 1920s, were starting to come into their own. The Weimar Republic was starting to grow in strength in a way. And when things are good, no one goes to the extremes. However, the Wall Street crash in October of 1929 changes that. And from there, the Nazis' election success just grows and grows and grows, until in 1933 it becomes almost undeniable to allow Hitler to become Chancellor. Now, under Hindenburg, the president at the time, he was deemed to be a good check for Hitler, and would keep him in line. However, if you look at, and I'll post a picture of, although the picture doesn't really do it justice, on the night that Hitler was given the chancellorship, there was a torchlight parade that went by the windows of both Hitler and Hindenburg, and you can see Hindenburg kind of realises right there that it's been a bad move to do that. Now, from there, from sort of January of 1933, over the next 18 months, he comes to power in January 1933 as the Chancellor. There's the mysterious Reichstag fire in February of 1933, blamed on the communists, and a Dutch communist is deemed to be guilty of the crime. However, it is today widely acknowledged and widely accepted that it was the Nazis that set the fire, and that allowed them to bring in the enabling law, which was more or less dictatorial powers, which came into effect in March of 1934. That meant that Hitler could rule by decree. He didn't need to run anything by Hindenburg anymore. And so slowly but surely, they began marginalising the role of the president and putting the power into the hands of the Nazi Party and Hitler as Führer. However, the title would not come at that point. In late June, early July of 1934, there was what came to be known as the Night of the Long Knives. That is where Hitler, under perhaps his own sort of paranoia, decided that the SA were too powerful and could potentially overthrow him and take over control. Ernst Röhm was the head of the SA at the time, and he, along with numerous other SA members, were summarily executed that night, and the power of the SA was very much curtailed, with the power transferring mostly into Heinrich Himmler and the SS from that point on. What also happened after that was that the German army would begin swearing an oath of loyalty not to the fatherland, not to Germany, but to Adolf Hitler himself. They were loyal to him. They were his army. And again, that just shows the growth of his power. Now, in August of 1934, becomes the final nail in the coffin of German democracy comes with the death of Hindenburg. Now, upon his death, Hitler merged the chancellorship and the office of president into one, and he became both. He became the Führer of Germany at that point. Now, from there, Hitler, having consolidated power, looked outwards, looked to create a greater Germany, starting with the areas that they lost during following the end of World War I and the Treaty of Versailles. Now, one of the first places they marched into was in March of 1936, which was the Rhineland, which is a demilitarised zone between France and Germany. They were given explicit instructions that if they faced any resistance, they should turn back. They faced no resistance, and when this was discussed in the British Parliament, Lord Lothian was quoted as saying they're only going into their own back garden, so it was not for us to interfere, or indeed anyone to interfere. Point 1. After that, Hitler turned his attention to unifying his home country of Austria and Germany. He saw it as German-speaking nations, German-speaking people should be joined up, and the creation of Lebensraum for future German generations as well. Now, this was not something that the Austrian Prime Minister at the time was very much in favour of. However, he was removed from office. The referendum in March of 1938, Hitler marches the troops into Austria at the request of the Austrian Nazis in order to provide support and help to Austria. They held a referendum the next month in April, and the Anschluss, which again was banned by the Treaty of Versailles, was formed between Austria and Germany. Hitler's next territorial demand was Stateland in Czechoslovakia. This prompted him to have 3 meetings with Neville Chamberlain, Prime Minister of Britain at the time. In the first meeting, Chamberlain was willing to give him all the areas of Stateland which had 50% more of German occupants. Hitler agreed to that. Then at the second meeting, he decided he didn't accept that and wanted all of the Stateland. And then that was given to him. And at the final meeting, after having agreed that, in Munich, he was told that he had no more territorial demands, and this was his final one. And Neville Chamberlain did give a speech at the time, or prior to this, to say, and I'll post it up and I'll read it as well, saying how horrible, fantastic and terrible it is that we should be digging trenches and trying on gas masks here because of a quarrel in a faraway country between people of whom we know nothing. He also came back on his plane from Munich holding a piece of paper which he called Peace in Our Time. That would last until March of 1939, when the Nazis invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia after pressuring the Slovaks, or allowing the Slovaks to declare their independence, and basically they became a vassal state of Nazi Germany. The rest of the Czech Republic, or the Czech lands, which then was taken into Nazi control. Now at that point, Chamberlain had realised that he had been duped and agreed with the Poles that should any of their lands be put under threat by Nazi aggression, that Britain and France would guarantee their safety. There was no move on Poland until September of 1939. On the 1st of September, the Nazis entered Poland, having created a false attack by the Poles on a German radio shack, and deemed that as an act of war. And on the 3rd of September at 11 AM, Britain declared war on Germany. So Hitler had played his role from the war, the First World War, up to the start of the Second World War, as someone who was unrelenting in his pursuit of power. He set out his goal of aggression and power by any means, originally by the bullet, then by the ballot, and then he held it by fear, between the SA and the SS. So thus comes to an end the profile of Adolf Hitler. It's a very, very kind of quick whirlwind tour of him. Again, there will be multiple other videos that will tackle other areas a lot more. This is just up to the start of the Second World War. We'll look at the Holocaust in a later video because it deserves a video all to itself. It'll probably be just as long as this one has been, perhaps even split it up into several parts, however. But that ends the second episode. There won't be 3-4 weeks between this one and episode 3, hopefully, providing nothing else gets in the way. And I have a good plan of about 10 or 11 ideas to carry forward as well, so hopefully we won't be waiting too long again. Okay, cheers, bye.